Welcome to the ACT Basics Prep course. This is the English section. So we know that the ACT English test has 5 passages. And so for each passage, you want to do all the easy questions and then do the difficult questions. Sometimes the no correct or, the answer choice that suggests nothing is wrong is actually correct. Sometimes what they give you is correct. So don't totally rule that option out. Remember to look at one error at a time, use the process of elimination, and letter of the day. So the technique for this section is similar to all the other sections. Answer choices give you clues that you need, so you have to brush up on your basics and be prepared to do well. So back to the basics, parts of speech, such as noun, verbs, articles, adverbs, adjectives, prepositions, phrases, prepositional phrases, pronouns, clauses, independent clauses, and dependent clauses. Just a little bit about clauses. As he ran across the room, Tom broke the vase. So the main clause is the clause that can stand by itself, or it's also called an independent clause. And that would be Tom broke the vase, because it can be a sentence all by itself. What's the dependent clause? As he ran across the room. As is a preposition in front of he ran across the room. And you can make that clause independent by taking away what word? As. Great. You can write sentences in a variety of ways, as long as you have a subject and verb. Often one word or preposition, can make an independent clause dependent. And so I'm kind of breezing through this, but for you to really understand it, you're going to have to immerse yourself into some of these basic exercises, but they're on the blog, so I'm just giving you an overview in the video. Clauses. So here are the most used structures that they'll kind of test you on, and you want to notice the punctuation. An independent clause, period, then a new independent clause. I set the table, my sister washed the dishes. Then you have an independent clause, a comma plus a conjunction, and another independent clause. I set the table, comma, the conjunction is and, my sister washed the dishes. My sister washed the dishes and I set the table are both independent clauses. So what is joining these two independent clauses? A conjunction, the word and, but other conjunctions are or, but, for, nor, yet. You do not put a comma before because. So when do you use commas? When you have an independent clause and a modifying, and that just means a describing phrase. So hungry and excited, comma, the bird snapped up the bagel. So the bird is hungry and excited. So it's describing the bird in the independent clause. So you want to separate it by a comma. You want to use commas in series, and you want to put the comma before the word and. You want to use a comma to separate an introductory phrase or phrase words. For instance, the great and wonderful teacher of the world, comma, Miss Hodge saw my mama at the store yesterday. And so you also want to use a comma when it's connecting two independent clauses with a conjunction. Restrictive versus non-restrictive. Another way to say that, and an easier way to say that, is important information versus non-important info. Easy. So if the info is important to the sentence, you don't need a comma. But if you don't really need the information, you use commas to set it apart. For example, people who are pregnant are advised to sleep on their sides. Who are pregnant describes the people who are advised to sleep on their sides. So you can't separate who are pregnant away from the sentence in order for it to make sense. Thus, no commas are needed. But in the second example, my daddy who is funny thinks he's a professional comedian. You don't need who is funny to make the sentence work. So you set that apart with commas. If you didn't have who is funny, the sentence would read, my daddy thinks he's a professional comedian. And the sentence would be just fine. Dashes. Dashes are used to indicate an abrupt break in thought or explanation or afterthought. Oftentimes they are used a dash is used in a pair unless at the end of a sentence. For example, my boyfriend, yes he is fine, thinks I'm playing him. Yes he is fine is an abrupt break in the thought, so you use a dash to set it apart. The other example, you are really funny, dash, I'm busting a gut, is a break in thought, it's an afterthought, and it's at the end of the sentence, so you only use one. How do you spot dash errors? If any of the answer choices contain a dash, compare the dash to the punctuation in the other answer choices. Check the non-underlined part for dashes that might be related to the one in the underlined portion to isolate a clause or a phrase. Ask yourself whether this sentence contains a sudden break in thought, an explanation, or afterthought. Remember, if it's in the middle of the sentence, you have to have two dashes. If it's at the end, only one dash is needed. Colons. Basically, colons introduces a list after a complete statement. This example is wrong. Henry purchased his dorm room necessities including, a vacuum cleaner, french fries, shampoo, and soap. Henry purchased his dorm room necessities including is not a complete sentence, therefore the colon is wrong. If you look at the correct example, Henry purchased his dorm room necessities, a vacuum cleaner, french fries, shampoo, and soap. Henry purchased his dorm room necessities is a complete sentence, so having a colon after that independent clause is correct. How do you spot colon errors? If you see a colon in the answer choices, ask yourself, is there a list being introduced by an independent clause? If so, then it's correct. If not, it's probably incorrect. And as example, again, as another just trick alert, which we talked about in the previous slide, that including makes that independent clause a dependent clause, thus you can't use a colon after it. Fragments. The first type of fragment they'll test you on is a dependent clause waiting for a second half that isn't there. The second type of fragment that they'll test you on is a fragment that needs to be incorporated into the sentence coming immediately before or after the fragment through the use of punctuation marks. How do you spot sentence fragments? You should be able to do it more easily now that you know what a dependent clause is. Also, looking at the answer choices, especially if it's punctuation, gives you an idea if they're looking for an answer that reflects sentence construction. Sometimes, less than a quarter of the time, no change is correct. Comma splices and run-ons. A comma splice has two independent clauses joined by a comma. Example, Aunt Sally ran into the room, Tom was already gone. How do you fix this? You could use a period after Aunt Sally ran into the room. You could use a conjunction before Tom, such as Aunt Sally ran into the room and Tom was already gone. Or you can use a semicolon, which is used to connect two independent clauses or two sentences that can stand by themselves. Run-on. Basically, a run-on is similar to a comma splice without having a comma. Aunt Sally swept up the shards of glass. She was furious. How do you fix this? Similar to the way you fix a comma splice. You can either use a semicolon, a comma, and a conjunction, or, let's go back to the previous one, or a period. Between Aunt Sally swept up the shards of glass, period, she was furious. Comma splices and run-ons. How do you spot these errors? Look at the punctuation in the answer choices. If you see that one or more give you the option of breaking up the sentence into two, think that it might contain a comma splice or run-on. Are they two independent clauses joined together? If so, one of the answer choices will fix it, whether it be a period, conjunction, or semicolon. Now, misplaced modifiers. And modifiers are words that describe. Therefore, they need to be by the word that they describe. This is the wrong way to use a modifier. Sweeping up the shards of glass, the missing key to the jewelry box was found by Aunt Sally. Can missing keys sweep up shards of glass? No. So the correct version would be, sweeping up the shards of glass, Aunt Sally found the missing key to her jewelry box. Aunt Sally is the one who sweeps up the shards of glass, so it should come after the modifying phrase. How do you spot misplaced modifier errors? If the underlying portion of the sentence is part of a modifying phrase, check to make sure it modifies the correct noun. If the underlying portion of the sentence includes the noun that is supposed to be modified, check to make sure it is the correct noun. Construction shifts. Similar to misplaced modifiers, except one word needs to be moved over. How do you spot construction shift errors? The answer choices will involve one word that is moved around in the answer choices. English, non-parallel construction. To fix this, make sure that everything, the verb or the noun, is the same. This is wrong. 3 explanations for Sid's locking himself in his room were a desire to do his homework, a sense that he needed to hone his college essay, and disliking his brother Tom, who always got away with murder. This is correct. 3 explanations for Sid's locking himself in his room were a desire to do his homework, a sense that he needed to hone his college essays, and a dislike of his brother Tom, who always got away with murder. Disliking is not the same as a dislike, so using disliking is incorrect. But if you use a dislike, it's the same as using a desire and a sense. So make sure you don't forget don't forget to use the serial comma before the and in the series. Just another example. Flying, driving, slept. Slept is different than flying and driving. Another example would be pretzel, chip, and tomatoes. Tomatoes is plural, pretzel and chip are not. So how do you spot parallel construction errors? Be on the lookout for series of actions or nouns. Also look for a change in verb tense of the way nouns are set up among the answer choices. Apostrophes. Possession or missing letters in a word. What are the apostrophe rules for possessives? What are the apostrophe rules for contractions? What are the differences between its, and its? What are the differences between whose and whose? These are things that you can find on the blog. So how do you spot an apostrophe error? If any underlying portion or answer choice contains an apostrophe, ask yourself if it's supposed to form a contraction or make a noun possessive and which form is correct. Make sure you know the difference between its with an apostrophe and its without an apostrophe. And how do you spot punctuation errors? Just look at the answer choices. The changes will alert you to what the ACT writers are trying to do. Pronouns. They'll test you on agreement. For instance, a pronoun must always agree with the noun to which it refers. And what's the error? Any young boy who watched the first moon landing probably spent the next few years wishing that they will become an astronaut. The subject of this sentence is any young boy, and they represents that. So they is plural and any young boy is singular, so they should be corrected to he. And so use the correct pronoun even if it sounds funny. For instance, any young boy who watched the first moon landing probably spent the next few years wishing that he could become an astronaut. And that he might sound funny, but it's correct. The following indefinite pronouns are singular: anybody, each, somebody, anyone, everybody, someone, either, everyone, and nobody. Here's an example. Although the American bald eagle has been on the endangered species for years, they have been sighted in wildlife preserves much more frequently during the past year. You have American bald eagle, they, that's not the same. American bald eagle is singular, they is plural. So you will use which one? D. It has been. Great. Case. If a pronoun is the subject of a sentence, it must be expressed as a subject. Subject pronouns are I, we, you, he, she, it, they, and who. And if a pronoun is the object of a sentence or preposition, it must be expressed as an object. And object pronouns are me, us, you, him, her, it, them, and whom. So how do you spot pronoun errors? You want to look for pronouns in answer choices or in underlined portions. Determine which noun the pronoun is replacing. If it's singular, the pronoun has to be singular. If it's plural, it has to be plural. And if it's a subject, the pronoun has to be in subject form. And if it's an object, it has to be in object form. And one pronoun that people always mess up is who versus whom. Who is a subject and whom is the object. Pronoun verb agreement. This is wrong. Each of these moments have played in my mind again and again as I try to recapture the excitement of that momentous day in June. Correct. Each of these moments has played in my mind again and again as I try to recapture the excitement of that momentous day in June. So each is singular, not plural, so has is correct, not have. How do you spot subject-verb agreement errors? You want to cut through the fluff. Mark through anything that separates the subject from the verb, and that can give you a clearer idea of what verb to use. And again, use the answer choices. If the underlying portion of a sentence contains a verb, check to see if the answer choices contain different forms of that verb. If so, you have a possible subject-verb agreement error. Verb tense. Do you know the difference between present, past, future, present perfect, past present perfect, and future perfect tense? If not, check the blog. Trick alert, when you look at the word or look at the ending ing, look at that carefully because the writers like to use the verbs having or being, which are often used incorrectly. They also like to put together two perfectly fine past tense verbs to create a past tense construction that does not work. For example, Mike has ate all the cookies in the cookie jar. That doesn't work. Ate or has eaten would be correct. And how do you spot verb tense errors? If you see a verb in the underlying portion or answer choices, it's testing subject-verb agreement or tense. Ask if the subject and the verb agree. If it does, it could be testing tense. And make sure that verb's tense is consistent with the tense of the verbs in that sentence or surrounding sentences. Be careful because sometimes it is correct. Example, once he has finished reading, he will set the table. Like, that's correct. There's nothing wrong with that. Oh, adjectives and adverbs. Adjectives modify nouns. Adverbs modify everything else. Adjectives, verbs, and other adverbs. He or she is very blank. And if it fits, it's an adjective. For instance, intelligent versus intelligently. If you say he or she is very intelligent, that works. And that's an adjective. But if you try to use he or she is very intelligently, that's an adverb and not an adjective. So, do you know how to make adjectives and adverbs comparative or superlative? If not, check the blog. And I know this is a lot of information, guys. Just keep your seatbelt on tight and we're going to get through this. English, idiomatic expressions. And these things are natural. You can spot them based on the prepositions in the answer choices. This is wrong. My sculpture is based after Rodin's thinker, and this is correct. My sculpture is based on Rodin's thinker. You know, it might not be correct grammatically, but it's correct because it's an idiomatic expression. Alright, we're almost finished, guys. English and the rhetorical skills. And you want to save these types of questions for last because they'll test strategy, organization, and style. So strategy is a skill concerned with how the author decides to word his or her thoughts. And there are two main types of questions that they'll be looking at, and they involve transitions and or improvement questions. So there are three main transitions, but, also, therefore, and words take variations of but, also, therefore. For instance, but means a contradiction, or that the idea goes against the idea before or after it. And words that are a derivation of but include however, quite the contrary, despite, rather, notwithstanding, contrarily, on the other hand, on the contrary, although, yet, nevertheless. So here's an example. I wanted ice cream, but I was trying to lose weight. The second part of that sentence contradicts the first part. You know, they want to eat ice cream, but they can't because they're trying to lose weight. The second type of transition is called therefore, and that looks at cause and effect. Basically, the first half of the idea causes the second idea, hence the word causes a relationship. Other words similar to therefore include hence, and so, thus, consequently, for example, because of, finally, in conclusion. For example, in conclusion, I need to mark the ACT because I took this course. So the first half of the idea, I need to mark the ACT. Why? Because I took this course, and that's a cause and effect relationship. The last type of transition is called also or in addition. Words similar to also include in addition, for example, furthermore, another, and, first, second, moreover, by the same token, besides, so too, and similarly. The second idea is added to or in addition to the first. For example, I don't smoke because it's not good for you. By the same token, I don't drink. They don't smoke because they're concerned about their health. Thus, they're not going to drink either. Okay, how do you spot transition questions? The underlying portion of a transition is almost always at the beginning of a new clause, sentence, or paragraph. The answer choices themselves will help you spot the connectors from the list. So try to replace the underlying word with but, therefore, or also first. And then choose an answer choice that matches the list of connecting words under that particular category. Improving the passage. And basically they want you to improve the passage instead of fixing errors. And they want you to choose a correct answer based on the purpose of a sentence or the effect of the passage on the reader. And how do you spot these improving the passage questions? And they're often a question that you don't even need the passage to answer. Also, pay close attention to the wording of the question itself because it can help you eliminate answers. Now, organization. Again, these are some of the questions you want to save for last because it involves a lot. So with organization, they might ask you to reorder a sentence or ordering sentences within a paragraph or reordering paragraphs as a whole. Okay, organization. For reordering sentences within a paragraph or with really any organization question, the trick is to try to figure out which sentence or pair of sentences or paragraph comes first so you can connect it in some type of way. And how do you spot organization questions? You want to look for words like ordering, organize, and summary. Style. Most of these questions involve redundancy or saying the same things twice. And how do you spot redundancy? Basically, look to see if the question or the answer choices involve saying the same thing twice. If they do, then get rid of it. Other style questions include slang, wordiness, which means don't be too wordy. Just say what you need to say. You don't have to say it in so many words. Get to the point. And irrelevancy. If a sentence has nothing to do with something in the paragraph, it's irrelevant. Therefore, you can use process of elimination with ease easily. So guys, we're at the end of the course. I know it was short and sweet, but that's great because I want you to get to work. You have your workbook sheets, you have the blog, you have a list of things that you need to work on. Now it's time to get to work. Guys, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me back or reply to any of the emails so we can talk in detail. We really want you to do well, and please, please, please take advantage of us. Thanks guys, you've been great. Good luck!